2 hours before her wedding, Naomi Carter stood in front of a mirror, surrounded by white flowers and careful lighting, holding her phone like it had just burned her. The dress was perfect. The venue was perfect. Everything was exactly what it was supposed to look like. And that was the problem. She didn't call her mother. She didn't call her friends. Instead, she opened a name she hadn't touched in over a decade, Adrian Cole, and typed 8 words. "If you still want me, come get me." 2 hours later, a helicopter landed in the middle of her wedding. The question was never whether he would come. The question was what she had just walked into. Naomi Carter had always known how to hold herself together in rooms where falling apart wasn't an option. It was a skill she had built quietly over years, the kind that doesn't get listed on a resume, but shows up in everything you do. She worked in brand creative, the kind of work where the story you tell on the outside has to be sharper than whatever is actually happening on the inside. She was good at it. Too good, maybe, because somewhere along the way, she had started applying that same discipline to her own life, curating the version of herself that was easiest to believe in, and filing everything else away. Somewhere, no one could reach it. She was 34 years old, and she was getting married the next day. That was the fact she kept returning to as she sat at her kitchen counter the evening before the wedding, a glass of wine she hadn't touched, sitting next to her laptop. The city outside her window doing what cities do at night, moving, glowing, indifferent. Everything for the ceremony was confirmed. The venue, the flowers, the dress hanging in the second bedroom, like a white flag she'd planted in her own future. Leonard had handled most of the logistics himself, which she had once taken as a sign of care. He liked things done correctly. He liked being the one who made sure of it. Leonard Hayes was the kind of man who walked into a room and made other people stand up straighter, without meaning to. He was a senior partner at one of the most respected litigation firms in the city, polished in a way that read as effortless, but was absolutely not. He had chosen Naomi with the same deliberate attention he brought to everything slowly, visibly, in a way that made her feel seen. He was patient. He was measured. He remembered details about her that she hadn't realized she'd shared. In the beginning, all of that had felt like intimacy. It had taken her longer than she wanted to admit to understand the difference between a man who pays attention because he loves you and a man who pays attention because information is useful. The email came at 9:17 that evening. It wasn't addressed to her. It had been forwarded 3 times before it reached her inbox through someone who clearly wanted it to land somewhere it couldn't be ignored. The subject line was blank. The attachment was a folder. Inside were photographs, financial records, and a lease agreement for an apartment in a different part of the city, signed under a name she didn't recognize, but linked clearly and methodically back to Leonard. A second phone number, a second residence, 2 years of evidence that someone had been living a parallel life and doing it carefully enough that it had almost worked. Naomi sat with that folder open on her screen for a long time. She didn't cry. She didn't close the laptop. She just read everything twice, the way she would read a contract, before signing it, looking for the part where the terms changed, where the language shifted, where what was being promised stopped matching what was actually being offered. The wine stayed untouched. Somewhere outside, a car alarm went off and then stopped. The city kept moving. She kept reading. She called Leonard at 10 o'clock. He picked up on the second ring, which told her he had been expecting it. She didn't raise her voice. She told him she had seen the records, the photographs, the lease. She asked him plainly what he wanted to say. Leonard was quiet for exactly long enough to signal that he had already decided how this conversation would go. Then he said that what she had received was taken out of context, that she was overreacting, that she had always had a tendency to do that. His voice was the same voice he used in depositions, calm, precise, designed to make the other person feel like the unreasonable one in the room. When she didn't respond the way he expected, the tone shifted. Not dramatically, Leonard didn't do dramatic, but the warmth drained out of his voice, the way heat leaves a room when a window opens in winter. and what was underneath it was something colder and more deliberate than anything he had ever shown her before. He said that if she chose to make a scene out of this, if she decided to embarrass him in front of his colleagues and clients and everyone who would be watching tomorrow, he would have no choice but to protect himself. He knew people. He knew how industries worked, how reputations were built, and how quickly they could be dismantled. He knew enough about her professional history, her clients, her contracts to make things very difficult for a very long time. He said all of this the way someone reads a prepared statement evenly without emotion, like it was simply the logical consequence of her making the wrong choice. Naomi listened until he finished. Then she said goodnight and she hung up. She sat in the kitchen for another hour without moving. What was settling over her was not grief exactly. It was something more specific than that. It was the recognition that she had been managed, that the relationship she had been living inside had been constructed around her, not with her. Every moment of patience, every remembered detail, every gesture that had felt like care had been load-bearing in a way she hadn't seen. She hadn't fallen in love. She had been positioned. The thing about a trap, she thought, is that it doesn't feel like one while you're walking into it. It only becomes visible when the walls close in. She had no clean path forward. Going to her family meant explanations she didn't have the energy to give, and involving them gave Leonard more surface area to work with. Calling a lawyer at this hour the night before a public event with hundreds of guests and cameras would take days to produce any protection she could actually use. Her name was already tied to this wedding in ways that were professional as well as personal. Clients, collaborators, people who had been told a story about her life that she would now have to unsell. Leonard had known exactly what he was doing when he built this. The timing wasn't incidental. The exposure wasn't accidental. If she moved alone, and she had to move before morning. She picked up her phone and opened her contacts. She scrolled past names she trusted, people she genuinely cared about, and stopped at one she hadn't opened in more than 10 years. Adrian Cole. The name sat there in her screen, the way certain memories do, familiar enough to be real, distant enough to feel like something you might have imagined. They had known each other a long time ago in a different version of both their lives. What they had been to each other was something she had never quite found the right word for. Not a relationship in any simple sense, but a connection that had weight to it, the kind that doesn't dissolve cleanly, no matter how much time passes. When things had ended between them, and they had ended badly without resolution for reasons that had never been fully spoken, he had said one thing she had never forgotten. He had told her that if she ever needed him for any reason, she only had to say so. That he would come back. That the offer had no expiration date. She had told herself she would never use it. That was pride talking. That was also, she understood now, a version of herself who had believed she would never need to. Naomi typed the message, slowly, deleted it twice, and then typed it again, without changing a single word. 8 words. She pressed send before she could talk herself out of it, then set the phone face down on the counter and did not look at it again that night. She didn't know if he would respond. She didn't know what kind of man he had become, whether the person who had made that promise was still someone who kept them. She was placing all of it, her instinct, her history, her one remaining option, on a decade-old guarantee from someone she had chosen to walk away from. It was reckless. She knew it was reckless. But reckless and wrong were not always the same thing, and she was out of careful moves. She went to bed. She did not sleep. At 6 in the morning, she got up, put on the dress, and went to the venue. Because the one thing Leonard had not accounted for, the one thing his planning had missed, was that Naomi Carter had already stopped acting like a woman with something to lose. She was going to walk into that room, stand in front of those people and wait. Because either Adrian Cole was still who she believed him to be, or she was about to face the consequences of finding out she was wrong. Either way, she was done being managed. The venue was a garden estate on the edge of the city, the kind of place that costs enough to signal permanence, all stone pathways and white draping. and an open sky that on this particular morning was an unreasonable shade of blue. Naomi had arrived early and been ushered through the side entrance by a coordinator who kept touching her arm and telling her she looked beautiful. She said thank you each time. She meant nothing by it. In the bridal suite, someone handed her a glass of champagne she set down and didn't return to. And someone else adjusted the back of her dress for the third time, as though the fit were the thing that needed fixing. Through the window, she could see guests beginning to fill the white chairs below. She recognized some of them. She smiled at the window at no one, because it was easier than explaining. Leonard appeared at the door of the suite 40 minutes before the ceremony. This was not unusual. He was a man who moved through schedules the way other people move through air, without apparent effort, always exactly where the plan placed him. He looked the way he always looked in public, composed, handsome in a deliberate way, wearing a suit that had clearly been pressed that morning by someone whose job it was to ensure he never looked like he'd had a difficult night. He had. She knew he had. But you wouldn't find it anywhere on him. He closed the door behind him and looked at her with something that was not quite warmth and not quite warning, but lived in the space between the two. He told her she looked stunning. He said it the way he said most things, accurately, efficiently, without sentiment. Then he told her that he was glad they were on the same page, that he knew she was a smart woman who understood how these things worked, and that today was going to be exactly what it was supposed to be. He wasn't asking, he was confirming. And the particular horror of it, Naomi thought, was how natural it sounded. How completely he had mapped the terrain of this conversation before walking into it, and how little space he had left for any version of events that didn't end with her walking down that aisle. She said nothing. She looked at him until he looked away first, which he did briefly, almost imperceptibly, before straightening his jacket and leaving the room. That small moment was the only honest thing that passed between them all morning. The ceremony began on time. Of course it did. Naomi walked when she was supposed to walk, stood where she was supposed to stand, and held the bouquet at the angle the coordinator had demonstrated twice during rehearsal. The officiant's voice was warm and practiced. The guests were still. Leonard stood at the end of the aisle with his hands folded in front of him, watching her approach with an expression that she understood now was not love. It was ownership confirmed, a transaction moving cleanly toward completion. She kept her face neutral. She had been doing that her whole adult life. Today was just the day it mattered most. The officiant had been speaking for perhaps 4 minutes when the sound arrived. It came from the north side of the property, a low mechanical rhythm that didn't belong to anything on the schedule building, steadily until it was impossible to ignore. Several guests turned their heads. A woman near the back stood up to look. The sound resolved itself into something specific and unmistakable rotors. A helicopter, descending toward the far end of the garden, with a precision that was clearly intentional, settling onto the open lawn beyond the stone wall, with a weight and finality that made the flower arrangements shudder. The ceremony did not continue. It simply stopped the way all things stop when something larger and louder enters the room. Naomi did not turn around immediately. She watched Leonard's face instead, and saw the moment his composure cracked, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone more than 3 feet away. But she was close enough to see the muscle in his jaw tighten, the slight forward shift of his weight, the calculation running behind his eyes. He had not planned for this. For the first time since she had known him, something had happened that he had not planned for. She turned around then. Adrian Cole was walking through the garden gate. He was tall, in a way that the space around him seemed to reorganize itself to accommodate not physically imposing, so much as simply present, in a way that demanded acknowledgement. He was wearing dark clothing, nothing ceremonial, nothing designed to perform anything other than the fact of his arrival. He walked without rushing, which was almost more unsettling than if he had run, because it communicated that he had assessed the room and determined that urgency was unnecessary. His eyes found Naomi before he was halfway across the lawn, and he did not look away from her. He did not look at Leonard. He did not look at the guests, many of whom had risen from their chairs. He looked at her the way someone looks at the only thing in a room that matters. He stopped a few feet from the front of the ceremony. He didn't reach for her. He didn't say anything intended for the crowd. He looked at her steadily and said simply, and only to her, "You ready?" The question was so plain, so stripped of drama, that it took the moment a second to catch up to itself. Naomi looked at him. She looked at the 200 people watching her from white chairs. She looked at Leonard, who was now standing very still in the way that dangerous animals go, still not from calm, but from controlled decision-making. Then she handed her bouquet to the nearest bridesmaid, gathered the front of her dress in both hands, and walked across the lawn toward Adrian. She didn't run. She walked the same way he had, without rushing, without performance, with the specific kind of deliberateness that means a person has already made their decision and is simply crossing the distance between where they are and where they intend to be. Leonard moved before she reached the gate. He came forward fast, no longer managing his expression, the composure gone in the way it only goes when something genuinely beyond the plan has occurred. He put his hand on her arm, not a gentle hand, not the hand of someone appealing to emotion. It was a restraining grip, the kind that makes its message physical rather than verbal. He said her name once, sharply, and then told her loudly enough that the nearest rows of guests could hear that she was making a catastrophic mistake, that he would follow through on everything he had said, that she had no idea what she was walking away from. Adrian stepped forward then. He did not raise his voice. He looked at Leonard's hand on Naomi's arm and said, with a quietness that carried more threat than volume ever could, "Let go." One word and a verb. Leonard met his eyes. Whatever he found there made the calculation shift. He released her arm. He stepped back. His face had gone to something that was past anger, something colder, more private. The expression of a man already rerouting to the next available strategy. Naomi felt the absence of his grip, like a door closing behind her. She did not look back at him. She walked through the garden gate with Adrian, and the helicopter lifted them both off the ground before the noise of the disrupted ceremony had fully settled. They flew north. The city fell away beneath them, and then the suburbs, and then a stretch of open land that Naomi didn't recognize. And eventually the helicopter set down on a private property, a house that sat at the end of a long gravel road, understated from the outside in the way that things are understated, when the money behind them no longer needs to announce itself. She had not spoken during the flight. Neither had he. There was nothing wrong with the silence. It was the first silence that morning that hadn't felt like suppression. Inside the house, she changed out of the dress. Someone had anticipated that need. There was a set of clothes folded on a chair in the guest room, her size nothing elaborate. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a moment, after wearing jeans and a plain shirt, looking at her own face, without the veil and the careful makeup and the performance of it all. She looked tired. She looked more like herself than she had in months. She found Adrian in the main room standing at the window, with a coffee that he hadn't been drinking, looking out at the property. She sat down on the couch across from him, and they stayed like that for a few minutes. Two people who had not been in the same room in more than 10 years, occupying a silence that neither of them was in a hurry to fill. There was history between them that had never been resolved, and both of them knew it. And for the moment, that was enough, just to acknowledge, without dissecting. Eventually, Naomi asked him how fast he had been able to arrange the helicopter, and Adrian told her he had made the call before the ceremony started. She nodded. Then she asked a quieter question. How had he known before she even sent that message that something was wrong? The question landed between them and stayed there. Adrian set down his coffee. The slight change in the way he held himself was the first thing that told her the answer wasn't going to be simple. He looked at her with something that was not evasion, but was close to it, the face of someone deciding whether to give the honest answer or the careful one. She had known him long enough to read the difference. She waited. He told her he had known about Leonard for a while. Not everything, not all at once, but enough that he had been paying attention. He said he had looked into him. He said the folder she received the night before had not arrived by coincidence. The room did not change. The light was the same. The house was quiet. But something shifted in the air between them in a way that Naomi felt before she fully processed it. A slow internal restructuring, the kind that happens when a fact arrives that requires you to reassemble the meaning of something you thought you already understood. She looked at Adrian and understood that the man who had come for her today, the man she had trusted with the most private 8 words she had ever sent to anyone, had been moving pieces in her life before she had asked him to. He had not told her. He had not given her the choice of knowing. He had simply decided, the way Leonard had simply decided, the way powerful men had a habit of deciding what she needed, and then arranged it accordingly without her. The trust she had walked into this house carrying cracked along a fault line she hadn't known was there. She sat with that. She did not say anything yet. But the question that settled over her, quiet and heavy and impossible to put back down, was one she hadn't expected to be asking about. Adrian Cole, was this rescue, or was this just a different kind of trap? She didn't ask him to explain himself right away. That was a deliberate choice, not a passive one. Naomi had spent enough of her life in rooms where the person across from her had already decided how the conversation would go, and she was no longer willing to let urgency or emotion compress something that deserved to be examined slowly. So she sat with what he had told her, and she let it settle, and she looked at the space between them, the way you look at a document you're not sure you want to sign. Adrian, to his credit, did not try to fill the silence with damage control. He stood at the window, with his hands at his sides, and let her think. That was the first thing she noticed, that he was not explaining himself, not pre-justifying, not leaning forward to manage her reaction before she had fully formed it. He was simply waiting. That was different from what she had been living with. It was not, however, enough. After a while, Naomi said, "Walk me through it." Not angrily, not coldly, evenly the way she would ask a contractor to walk her through a proposal before she decided whether to accept it. Adrian turned from the window. He sat down in the chair across from her, elbows on his knees, and he told her the truth in the order it had happened. He had come across Leonard's name about 14 months ago through someone in his professional network who had dealt with him on a case that had been settled quietly and not in a way that reflected well on Leonard. He had looked into it. What he found made him look further. He said he had not gone looking for a reason to involve himself in her life, that he had told himself for months that it wasn't his place, that she was an adult who made her own choices, that whatever he had once felt had nothing to do with what she needed now. But the more he uncovered about Leonard, the harder it became to convince himself that saying nothing was the same as staying out of it. He told her the folder had been compiled over the course of several months. He had used a private investigator, then a second one to make sure the records were accurate and legally obtained. The decision to send it to her the night before the wedding was not spontaneous, it was calibrated. He had wanted her to have enough time to act, but not so much time that Leonard could maneuver around it. He said he had told himself that he was simply giving her information, that what she did with it was entirely her decision. He said it without defense, which made it worse because it meant he had thought it through and done it anyway. Naomi listened to all of it. When he finished, she sat forward and said, "You made a decision about my life without telling me you were making it." Adrian met her eyes. "Yes. You decided I needed protecting, and you arranged it before I ever asked you to?" "Yes. And the message I sent, the 8 words, you had already set things in motion before that arrived." He didn't answer immediately, and in that gap, she saw the full geometry of it. He had been waiting. The helicopter, the logistics, the readiness, all of it had been assembled before she reached out to him. Her message had not triggered his response. It had confirmed a plan that was already built. She had believed in sending those 8 words that she was making an active choice, that she was the one who had decided to reach for him. But he had already reached, first quietly, Without her knowledge, and what she had experienced as agency had been, at least in part, the feeling of stepping into a space someone else had already cleared for her. She stood up. She walked to the window where he had been standing and looked out at the property, the gravel road, the open land, the silence of a place that operated entirely outside of anyone else's view. It was a beautiful kind of isolation. That was the thing about power. When it was subtle, it didn't announce itself. It built you a room with no sharp edges and called it safety. She turned back to him and said, "I don't know how to make this cleaner than it is, so I'm just going to say it directly. What you did and what Leonard did are not the same thing. I know that. But they are not as different as you want them to be. You both looked at my life and decided without asking me that you knew what I needed. You both moved pieces around me while I was standing there thinking I was making my own choices. The fact that your intentions were better doesn't erase the method." Adrian did not look away from her. He did not argue. He said, "You're right." Those two words did something to the structure of the conversation. They did not fix anything, but they changed its shape, opened a door that defensiveness would have kept closed. Naomi looked at him and believed that he meant them, and believing it did not make her softer toward what he had done. It made her more precise about what she actually needed to say. She told him that she would not accept being handled, not by Leonard, who had done it with calculation and threat, and not by Adrian, who had done it with care and history. She said that care and history were not sufficient justification for making choices about someone else's life in silence. She said that if he wanted to be in her life in any capacity going forward, not as a rescuer, not as a figure from her past, but as a person who was actually present, then the first and non-negotiable condition was that he never made a decision that concerned her without telling her. That she would not trade one kind of management for another, no matter how different the intentions behind them felt. She said all of this calmly, without raising her voice, the way she would establish terms on a contract that she was willing to sign if, and only if, certain language was amended. She was not punishing him. She was not performing a boundary for the sake of it. She was telling him exactly what was true, because that was the only version of this conversation she was interested in having. Adrian was quiet for a moment, not evasive. Quiet, but the kind that means a person is genuinely receiving something rather than waiting for a gap to speak into. Then he said that she was right, that what he had done was a form of control, even if it hadn't felt like one from the inside, and that he had convinced himself the difference in intent made the method acceptable. He said he could see now that it didn't. He said he wasn't going to ask her to weigh what he had done against what she'd been walking toward, because that wasn't a fair scale, and he knew it. He said the only thing he could actually offer her was the truth going forward, and that if she decided that wasn't enough, if she decided she needed distance rather than a renegotiated version of whatever this was, he would accept that without argument. Something in his willingness to lose her made her believe him in a way that promises wouldn't have. She sat back down. Not because she had resolved everything. There was nothing in this situation that resolved cleanly, and she was too honest with herself to pretend otherwise. But because she was 34 years old, and she had just walked out of a wedding that had been a trap, and she was sitting across from a man she had trusted with the most unguarded 8 words she had ever sent to another person, and the world was not going to stop and wait for her to feel certain before asking her to decide something. Certainty, she had learned, was mostly something people invented in retrospect. You didn't get to have it in the present. You only got to have your own judgment and a decision, and the willingness to be accountable for how it turned out. She told Adrian that she wasn't starting over with him because he had come for her. She wasn't starting over because of their history, or because what they'd had 10 years ago had meant something, though it had. She was starting over, if they were starting over, because he had just sat in that chair and told her the truth without softening it, without redirect, without asking for absolution he hadn't earned. That was the only reason. And it was conditional. and she needed him to understand that conditions were not the same as distrust. They were the architecture of something that could actually hold weight. Adrian said he understood. Then, because he was the kind of person who knew when not to add more to a sentence that had already landed, he said nothing else. Outside, the afternoon light was moving across the property in long horizontal bands, the way it does in open places when the sun has passed its center point and begun its decline. Naomi looked at it through the window and thought about Leonard, not with grief, but with the particular clarity that comes after a long tension finally releases. He would follow through on some of his threats. That was almost certain. She would spend months managing the aftermath fielding calls, protecting the work she had spent years building. There would be legal letters, probably. There would be conversations she hadn't had yet and wasn't looking forward to. None of that was resolved. None of it disappeared because she had walked out of the garden. The consequences of today were not a hypothetical. They were already in motion, already on their way toward her, at whatever velocity Leonard's wounded pride could generate. But she had survived things before that she hadn't expected to survive, and she had done it by moving through them rather than around them. That part she was not afraid of. What she had been afraid of, without ever quite naming it, was arriving at a moment where she had stayed in the wrong life for so long that leaving it required someone else to carry her out. That was the fear she'd been managing under everything else. And what she understood, now standing on the other side of it, was that she had not been carried out. She had sent 8 words. She had made a choice in the only window of time she'd had. She had walked across that lawn herself, in her own dress under her own weight. Adrian had opened a gate. She had been the one who walked through it. There was a difference. She intended to hold on to it. She stood up from the couch and crossed the room to stand beside him at the window, both of them looking out at the same stretch of open land, not touching, not performing anything for each other. They stood the way people stand when they are at the beginning of something real, without the comfort of knowing how it ends, without the false warmth of pretending they do. Just 2 people in a room with the truth between them, deciding to see what could be built when you started from honesty rather than from whatever looked the most like safety. It wasn't a love story. Not yet, and maybe not ever in the way those stories are usually told. It was something more difficult and more durable than that. It was 2 adults choosing to be accountable to each other in a world that had just demonstrated very clearly the cost of anything less.